Hey there, my friends. Derek here from Bomb Socks with another day of Bomb Bites, where we feast upon the words of Christ, and we do it one bite at a time. So this week I want to conclude the Come Follow Me for this week. I want to backtrack a little bit and show you Genesis chapter 25, okay? Keeping in mind that the covenant that God made to Abraham is going to continue through his righteous son, Isaac. And we saw a little bit of that this week with the covenant marriage and everything like that. That's an important thing with this process. So Genesis 25, verse number 5, it says, "And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac." That is the birthright son. That's where that covenant continues. Verses 7 and 8, "And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, an 100 years." So Abraham lived to the ripe old age, 175. Verse 8, "Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." And then his sons Isaac and Ishmael bury him. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a silly question. Okay, so bear with me on this. How does God feel about Abraham? Okay, now obviously you're like, well, loves him, right? There's a few verses that I want to focus on that show you how God feels about Abraham. There's a reason why this covenant is called the Abrahamic Covenant. So there's three verses I would have you look at. James chapter 2, verse 23, it says, "And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." Now that's a cool, how would you like to be known as God's friend, right? The one who created universes without number, who knows everybody, who loves everybody. You're his friend. That's a great statement. I love that. Another reference I want to take you to is Isaiah 41, verse 8. Now, Isaiah 41, verse 8 says, "But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." I don't know if you're seeing a pattern here, but again, you have got the Lord saying, Abraham is my friend. That's a great statement. Well, one other verse, you go to Doctrine and Covenants section 132. Now, 132 talks a lot. That's the section about plural marriage. And Abraham and Sarah are brought up in all of this as examples of righteousness. Verse 29 of section 132, "Abraham received all things whatsoever he received by revelation and commandment, by my word, saith the Lord, and hath entered into his exaltation and sitteth upon his throne." So you have got Abraham, this friend of God, who now sits on his throne in the celestial kingdom. I love that. So I want you to do something for a second here, and you can do this as an individual, you can do this as a family. You go back and you think about what we have studied, or maybe what you have personally studied about Abraham, and you identify some of the things that made him a friend of God. And I'm just going to pop up some verses right here. If you're listening to this, you can study these as well. Abraham 1, verse 2, Genesis 13, verse 8, Genesis 14, 21 to 23, Genesis 15, 5 and 6, Genesis 17, verse 7, and then the concluding part of Genesis 22, those first 14 verses or so. And you can summarize those in the chapter heading. But if you go back through and study those, you're going to see some ways that you and I can both learn about how to be a friend of God. So take a few minutes. In fact, I'll pop these up right here if you're watching this. Go through and you can study these out. We'll come right back and we'll talk about a couple of them. So as you're doing this, you could even write down, how can I become a friend to God? Well, you go back to Abraham 1, where it talks about how Abraham wanted to be a greater follower of righteousness and desiring that priesthood. You go to Genesis 13, where you have Abraham's interaction with his nephew Lot, where there could have been contention. And Abraham backs up and says, "Let there not be strife, for we be brethren." You go to Genesis 14, where he won't even accept a shoelace from Sodom. You go to Genesis 15, 5 and 6, where the covenant, the promises are given to him as he stays faithful. You go into Genesis 22, where you've got his almost sacrifice of Isaac. You see a very righteous, faithful person who is doing his best to be able to become a friend of God. And he's doing this because he simply wants to be obedient, and he wants that greater righteousness and that greater happiness, the blessings of the fathers, that desire. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, how Abraham had this desire to be able to just be that righteous person, a greater follower of righteousness. Well, just kind of throwing this all together, you go back to section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and you go to verses 31 to 33. It does say this to us. Now, this was to Joseph and Emma, but I also think this is to us as well with regards to Abraham. This promise is yours also, because ye are of Abraham. And the promise was made unto Abraham, and by this law is a continuation of the works of my Father, wherein he glorifieth himself. Verse 32, go ye therefore, and do the works of Abraham. Enter into my law, and ye shall be saved. But if ye enter not into my law, ye cannot receive the promise of my Father, which he made unto Abraham. So in that sense, if you apply that to the way Abraham became a friend of God, go and do those works of Abraham. Do those things that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, and you'll be able to see how that is how we keep those covenants with God. We enter into those covenants and we keep them by doing those things. Abraham is a wonderful example. I am grateful for him. He's a scripture hero of mine, and I pray that we can be able to also become that friend of God by doing those things that we need to do. Anyway, I hope that helps you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. And thank you for sharing these messages. We very much appreciate that. Also, go check out our amazing gospel-themed socks at bombsocks.com. You guys have an amazing weekend. Godspeed, and we'll see you next time. See ya. Bye-bye.